Mr. President, now it's Thursday afternoon, and it's the time of the week that I usually come down and talk about one of my constituents or some Alaskan who's doing a great thing for their community or the state or the country. I call that our Alaskan of the week, but I'm going to suspend that this week because, to be perfectly honest, I think every one of my fellow Alaskans deserves a shout out. Maybe they're all Alaskans of the week this week for what happened and then the reaction to what happened in Alaska last Friday. And the country read about it, but it's the earthquake, the very significant earthquake that my state, my hometown of Anchorage, just went through. So, Mr. President, as you know, last Friday morning, 8:29 a.m., the citizens of South Central Alaska, which includes Anchorage and the Matsu Valley, were doing what they always do on a Friday morning. People were in their offices, driving to work, drinking coffee at home, maybe taking a run on many of the paved trails throughout our wonderful city. Students were either in school or almost getting to school, sitting at their desks, pencils, pen in hand, and then the shaking began. And it felt like it went on forever. I was first alerted. I was here in D.C. My wife was home at our home in Anchorage, sent me a text and said, we are having a big, massive earthquake. And we did. It was 7.0 on the Richter scale, which is a big earthquake even for Alaska. And moments later, another earthquake measuring 5.8 on the Richter scale hit. The epicenter was very close to downtown Anchorage, about 7 miles north. People all across the area ran out of their houses or offices, dove under their desks. Roads collapsed, pipes broke, ceiling tiles came crashing down, household goods cracked, kitchens all across the state looked like they had been invaded by violent giants. Thousands of people lost power, including my home in Anchorage. And Mr. President, Senator Murkowski and I, Congressman Young, we were here in D.C. I'm going to talk about that in a minute. But we went home soon after to see what happened, to see the damage. You saw the previous slide there. Senator Murkowski and I were out reviewing, assessing some of the damage. That previous, you want to put that previous one up there, Marcus? So this is an on-ramp to Minnesota Avenue, actually leading to the airport. That collapsed completely. That's how people get to the airport. You want the next one, Vine Road in the Matsu Valley, a major thoroughfare there, completely, essentially imploded. Houses and businesses were shook dramatically. You have another picture of Vine Road there. You want to put that up? That's the road that you just saw. It was rush hour in Alaska. Go ahead. Homes. Unfortunately, we're having a lot of problems with homes and businesses. This is just one of hundreds of businesses, ceilings collapsing, entire offices ruined, and then schools. The schools throughout the state suffered a lot of damage. Libraries, not just shelves collapsing, these books fly off the shelves, right, when you have a 7.0 earthquake. Another photo of some of the schools, ceilings collapsing, rebar coming out. This is a classroom. And, Mr. President, my view, just having been out there for a couple days back home, at least hundreds of millions of dollars of damage that we saw, and it's still happening. So when you have an earthquake of this magnitude, you have aftershocks, which are also very stressful and can be big and can do more damage. We have had over 2,700 aftershocks in the Anchorage Bowl. This is the Anchorage Bowl right here. 20 of them have been over 4.0. 5 have been over 5.0. That's a big earthquake, 5.0 earthquake. So we've had 5 more of those. So that's stressful, as you can imagine. People are tired. The first night after the earthquake, nobody was sleeping because of the number of aftershocks. When I was home, felt a number of these. But Alaskans are resilient. They have grit. They have spirit. They're tough. The phrase going around to describe the state right now, shaken, certainly, still shaken, going on today, but not broken. And there's frustration, and the country is going to need their help to rebuild. And that's going to happen here, I have no doubt. But, Mr. President, here is the amazing thing. Here's the amazing thing. I think it's a Christmas miracle. You saw that destruction. You saw at rush hour, kids in all these classrooms, and no fatalities. Not one death. You can rebuild a road, you can rebuild a school, but if we were burying our kids right now, this would be a very, very, very different tragedy. And remember, just going to work, it was dark. It's dark in Alaska in the morning. It's dark a lot of the day now in Alaska. It's cold. And yet, no fatalities and very few injuries. So what happened? How did that happen? In some ways, that's the positive story here. Well, Mr. President, we get a lot of earthquakes in Alaska. This is just a chart that showed from a couple years ago what kind of earthquakes we get. The presiding officer knows I come and talk about my state a lot, but just a few stats on earthquakes. Alaska is home to the second largest earthquake ever recorded in history, the 1964 Great Alaska Good Friday earthquake, magnitude 9.2 on the Richter scale. Lasted almost 5 minutes, if you can imagine that. And then we had a huge tsunami that killed dozens and dozens of people. 11% of all the world's recorded earthquakes are in Alaska. 3 of the 8 largest earthquakes the world has ever seen have been in Alaska. 7 of the 10 largest earthquakes in the United States were in Alaska. One magnitude 7 to 8 on the Richter scale every year happens in Alaska, but they don't happen normally in big populated areas. 6 magnitudes to 6 to 7 on the Richter scale happen every year in Alaska, but again, not near the major cities. Our state's so big that we have a lot of these and nobody gets hurt. Now, speaking of getting hurt, Mr. President, as you know, earthquakes of this size, a 7.0, even a 6.0, even a 5.0, when they're near population centers, normally in other parts of the world they do a lot of damage, and they certainly did a lot of damage in Alaska, but unfortunately they also take lives. They also take lives. Last year, for example, in Indonesia, there was a 6.9 on the Richter scale earthquake, killed almost 500 people. And it's not just developing countries. 2011 in New Zealand, a 6.3 on the Richter scale earthquake, killed over 150 people. As I said, Mr. President, we were fortunate. No deaths. So what's part of the reason for that? Well, given how many earthquakes we've had over the years, we've learned a lot. And the first thing is building codes. Fortunately, again, thank God, we had no buildings collapse. We had a lot of structures, homes, businesses, schools that have severe structural damage, but a collapsing building is where you get a lot of deaths. And with strong, strict building codes, particularly after the 1964 earthquake, that helps prevent that. But, Mr. President, it's also people who are resilient and tough and trained. And I want to talk a little bit about this because I have no doubt that this is why we had no fatalities. The group that I really want to do a shout out to and I'm just so proud of them, are the students. The students and the teachers who, in the middle of the beginning of the morning, and I went through some of these schools just the last few days, Houston Middle School, the elementary school, and Eagle River. These schools are just, look like someone has completely exploded them inside. And yet, Mr. President, these kids, young men and women, acted calm, heroic, and most importantly, they did what they've been trained to do. Now in Alaska, because we have so many earthquakes, the kids go through earthquake training all the time. Duck and cover under their desks. And there is a video that's kind of gone viral, because I know other kids in the country are looking at it. It's actually from a class right when this happened in Mr. Bennis's class. He's a teacher at the Mears Middle School in Anchorage. And the video was on because he was supposed to capture his lesson Friday morning. And he's a grad student, and he had to film the class and what he was teaching for his studies. And what it captured instead was students who are trained to react in ways that it's remarkable how automatic it was. One reporter, after they saw this in Alaska, called these kids in this classroom a well-oiled machine. What am I talking about? You watch it, the kids are sitting in their class, teacher's talking, and you see a little bit of shaking. Boom. Every kid, without being told, knows exactly what to do. They are under that desk. And then you see a lot of shaking. And then you see debris starting to come down. And if you're not under a desk, you could be seriously injured or even killed by some of what's coming from the ceiling, or worse. In Houston Middle School, when Senator Murkowski and I were touring, there were cinder blocks that were broken and shot out from the ceiling and the wall in these classrooms. And students are in there. But they were trained. And they were ducking and covering. In the video from Mr. Bennis's classroom, after the shaking was over, it's about a minute, which seems like an eternity when you're in it, a student can be heard asking, "Will they cancel school today?" Mr. Bennis replied, "Well, that's probably not the first thing we need to be worried about right now." Yesterday, a niece of one of my staff members here in D.C. said that that video of Mr. Bennis's class was being shown in schools in Iowa, including her school, Prairie View Middle School in Waukee, Iowa, because the teachers are showing their students, hey, this is what you do, this is why we train, and this is what you do when there's some kind of natural disaster. That training, literally, I have no doubt what happened in Alaska saved lives. So I want to thank those kids, those students. I am so proud, and I really, really want to thank the teachers of Anchorage and the Mat-Su Valley for doing this training for their kids. Month after month, year after year, it obviously paid off. What else, Mr. President, in terms of the reaction that you see, why, again, I think all of my constituents are the Alaskans of the week. The first responders, as they do in so many emergencies, our local heroes reacted immediately. Civil engineers and city and state workers immediately checked on all of these highways and bridges and off-ramps, some of which collapsed, essential infrastructure such as hospitals. The Port of Anchorage has had all kinds of structural damage, which is very dangerous in terms of the supply chain for my entire state. The U.S. Geological Survey and NOAA, the National Ocean and Atmospheric Administration, gave us real-time information about the earthquakes and, importantly, the potential tsunamis. There were tsunami warnings all over Alaska because of how worried we were being next to the ocean that may have triggered a tsunami. Thankfully, that did not happen. The state, local officials, the Anchorage Fire Department received hundreds of calls on damaged gas lines. We did have some house fires because of that. We did lose some houses because of that. Our utilities jumped into action. NSTAR, which is a natural gas company, went to over 700 houses that reported gas leaks. For the thousands who lost power, they got power back on in a relatively short time. And this is really important, Mr. President, because when it's 20 degrees out in Alaska and you lose power in the winter, it's not like we can borrow power from, Illinois or Kentucky we're there, alone and unafraid. We got to produce our own power. And yet our utility companies got power. They got power back on in my house in a few hours. Ken Bierman, he worked for NSTAR for 46 years before retirement. On November 9th, guess what he did as a utility guy? He suited up and came back to work on the job to just go out and help people. And that's the other thing, Mr. President. Alaskans went door to door checking on their neighbors. Shelters were immediately open. Hospitals prepared for what they thought were going to be massive injuries and potentially deaths. Churches, nonprofits were available. That's what Alaskans do. When you live out and alone in a part of the state that's pretty remote and communities are remote, that's what you have to do. And then the other group that kicked into gear, and I do want to thank my colleagues here, was the federal government. FEMA launched people almost immediately from the West Coast, and we were hearing from senior federal officials almost immediately. I want to commend the Trump administration and the rest of the federal government on just their quick reaction. So many of them are in Alaska now, but almost within an hour, the President of the United States, who was down in Argentina at the G20, tweeted, "To the great people of Alaska, you have been hit hard by the big one. Please follow the directions of the highly trained professionals who are there to help you. Your federal government will spare no expense. God bless you all." That was from the President. The Vice President, who was also traveling, called me and Senator Murkowski within a few hours. The Chief of Staff, General Kelly of the White House, called. Every one of them is, what can we do? How can we help? Who do we need to send? The Secretary of Transportation, I want to do a special shout out to Elaine Chao, has already checked in with me 3 different times. And they had people on their way up to help with these kind of major infrastructure damages. Same with our FEMA administrator, who's been a busy man, let's face it. Brock Long did a conference call with me, Senator Murkowski, Congressman Young. And I do also want to thank my Senate colleagues. A lot of the press likes to report, hey, we're always battling, we're always fighting. I don't think that's true, by the way. It's actually not true. Yeah, on certain things we have principled differences on, but on a lot of action here, it's bipartisan, and the relationships matter. I had within just a few hours, several of my colleagues, Democrats, Republicans, calling, texting, emailing, hey, Dan, we heard about Alaska. We're seeing these images on TV. We got your back. We're praying for you. And that means a lot. I was talking to Senator Pat Leahy, senator from Vermont, Democrat from Vermont, this morning about this very issue. And he's seen a lot here in the Senate. He's been in the Senate for a long time, over 4 decades. And you know what he said to me? It's important to remember when these kind of things happen, it reminds everybody in this body, we are the United States of America. The United States of America. We take care of each other when we know bad things are happening in different parts of the country. And Mr. President, kind of related again to this reaction, Senator Murkowski and I had the opportunity to go out to the Incident Command Center. And yes, there's times when you don't feel like the different levers of government are working or coordinating. Well, this, out on our military base, and by the way, our first responders include our military, our National Guard, who do such a great job. But this Incident Command Center would give any American pride because they were all there, almost like a battle, like a war, like an ops center for the military people watching. And it was FEMA, it was federal, it was the military, it was the state, it was local, all working like this, literally, hand in glove. So to my constituents, we're going to have a long road to recovery. There's no doubt about that. But people are already getting on it. There's going to be frustrations, and we got to work through those. And I know people are still scared and nervous and wondering how they're going to pay for all the damage. And we're going to work together through that. For my colleagues here in the Senate, you know, we've had a lot of natural disasters over the last few years, at least since I've been here in the Senate, throughout the country. Hurricanes, Florida, Louisiana, Texas, Houston, California just went through horrendous wildfires that killed so many of our fellow Americans. And this body acts. This body has acted with disaster relief funding. And I remember saying to a number of senators here and to my constituents, when those big, and some of those packages have been big in terms of the funding, in terms of the dollars, hey, Dan, we need your vote on this. None of that money was going to Alaska, but I remember saying each time, you know, I'm voting for these packages. Why? Well, I think it's the right thing to do, but also, let's face it, but for the grace of God, go me and my state and my constituents. I live in a state where there's all kinds of natural disasters, wildfires, earthquakes, volcanoes, tsunamis. But I think that's the attitude here in general. When bad things happen, particularly natural disasters, to other parts of the country, the vast majority of this body says, hey, I'm going to help. I'm going to help. So I'm already getting the sense that my colleagues here will make sure that that help comes to Alaska as we continue to assess the damage. And I also want to just mention to the American people, you know, who are watching, Alaskans or folks from the lower 48, Senator Murkowski and Congressman Young and I, we held a press conference on Friday afternoon after talking to the federal government, working closely with our state leaders to just give people information. And it was a national press conference, actually, the national media covered. So I took the opportunity, because a lot of this was still going on, and the aftershocks were going on. We didn't know. We didn't know if there was 200 people killed. So I asked people watching to pray for their fellow Americans up in Alaska. And, Mr. President, as I mentioned, yes, we are prepared. Yes, the building codes in Alaska are probably some of the strongest on the planet. Our students, I'm so proud of our students, were trained by great teachers. Our first responders were out there in the cold within minutes, let alone others working, and are still doing it, by the way. But I have no doubt that part of the reason we had 0 fatalities, 0 deaths, with a 7.0 earthquake in a city of almost 300,000 people. In most parts of the world, that would not be 0 deaths. It would probably be thousands. But I have no doubt that part of the reason was because of those prayers. So I want to thank anyone and everybody who was praying for Alaska that day, because I guarantee you it mattered. And to my fellow Alaskans, again, I want to thank you. I think on Friday, and even continuing up today, you represent the best of America, the best of what we, as Americans, love to see in our fellow Americans: resilience, toughness, preparedness, and helping each other. And that was on display and has been on display, and I couldn't be prouder to represent the great state of Alaska, particularly now. We have a lot of work to do. There's going to be frustrations. It's going to take time. But be assured that we will be working here and at home, Senator Murkowski and I, but with our colleagues, to make our recovery from this massive earthquake as speedy as possible. God bless. I yield the floor.